and welcome to Julie Reads Her Bookshelf. I'm Julie, and for those of you who are new to the channel, this is a channel where I read through all of my unread books on my bookshelf until I reach 0. So today I come to you with my monthly wrap-up video for June. It's a little bit late, but I'm running kind of a little bit behind schedule for each month. I read 3 books for June, and the first one relates to my reading theme of the year. So some of you who have watched my previous videos will know that every year I have a theme for the year that I read to, and I don't read only exclusively from that theme. I just kind of make a conscious effort to fill in some gaps in my reading by following a theme. And the theme for this year is Victorian literature. And so I read in the month of June Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy in this wonderful Reader's Digest version. This is an interesting book. So it's the first Thomas Hardy I read, and it has enough going on for me to keep reading him, but I don't know if he's going to become a favorite. So the story revolves around Tess, who is sort of this picture of innocence. The novel literally opens with her kind of dancing in white in the British countryside. So Tess's life takes an unexpected turn when her poor family discovers that they, the D'Urbervilles, are direct descendants of a noble family called the D'Urbervilles, who's sort of fallen into obscurity over time. And because of this family connection, Tess's family sends her to her wealthy relations called the D'Urbervilles, who aren't really her relations. They sort of bought the surname to make themselves more respectable. And at the D'Urberville mansion, she meets Alec D'Urberville, who becomes the primary cause of a fairly traumatic event that changes Tess's life. And so without giving away the spoilers, the traumatic event that happens to Tess completely derails her life. And she sort of tries to recover from it. She meets another young man called Angel Clare, who's this kind of really kind-hearted and idealistic and a bit of a dreamy character. And they meet, they fall in love. But the tragedy and trauma of Tess's life kind of hangs over their entire relationship, and eventually it all ruptures. I have kind of mixed feelings about this novel. On the one hand, I think Tess is one of the more interesting female characters in Victorian literature. She is this sort of unique blend of innocence, helplessness, but also she's incredibly principled as a person, and she has these kind of passionate outbursts. So there's kind of this weird tension between the really passionate and obstinate side of her and the kind of meekness that comes out, and the devotion that she has to Angel. And Hardy very subtly shows the kind of constraints and double standards on women in Victorian England. And I love the descriptions in the book about rural life and the relationship between these women who work on farms. These types of kind of rural novels about farm life in kind of pastoral life in England are a little bit old-fashioned. I do associate them with Victorian England, but Hardy's probably the best known author of this genre. Another thing I really like about this book is the role of class. And that really comes out when you look at kind of the interactions between Angel and Tess. Because on the one hand, Angel is sort of comes from a gentleman's family. Well, I think his dad is a preacher, whereas Tess is actually comes from a better family because of her connection to the D'Urberville family, who are kind of as good as it gets in British history. But on the other hand, they've become so impoverished and so obscure that she feels she is of a lower class than Angel, and she sort of looks up to him. But Angel, on the other hand, keeps Tess's connection to the D'Urberville family as a bit of a card up his sleeve when it came to his family's acceptance of Tess as a daughter-in-law. And so it says some pretty revealing stuff about Angel's character flaws. He isn't quite the kind of the McDreamy that we're led to believe initially. So all of these things I think are really well done as part of the novel. There's really interesting dimensions of class, of gender. The characters are quite complex. Their characters and motivations and their actions make sense for who they are and what happened to them. What I really couldn't stand about this book is the ending, and I won't spoil what happens. If you know what I'm talking about. And I don't have a problem with the tragic element of it. I went into this book knowing and expecting that is what Thomas Hardy is known for. He's not the most cheerful author you could read, but I really didn't like the fatalistic element of the ending. It was when you get to kind of the last, 50 pages of the book, there's this sudden escalation of action that just didn't make sense in the context of the broader book. And there's this scene towards the very end where they're literally at the Stonehenge, and the symbolism and the fatalism of that scene was just so heavy-handed that it really took me out of the book, whereas up until then I was really on board the Thomas Hardy train. So overall, mixed feelings about Tess of the D'Urbervilles. I thought it was a really well done novel. I really enjoyed the character of Tess. I really enjoyed the interactions and the tensions between class and gender that comes out really well in this book. But the ending just really gave the book a different vibe, I felt. So there's enough in this book for me to keep going with Thomas Hardy, but I don't know that he's going to be one of my favorite authors going forward from the Victorian era. But I probably need to read a second novel by him to make up my mind about him. So maybe Far from the Madding Crowd, if I have time before the end of the year. The second book I read in the month of June is Gilead by Marilyn Robinson. Now, I've had this book for probably 10 years. I think I bought this book fairly early on when it was released, and after it won the Pulitzer Prize because there's a sticker on it. So I'm very, very happy to have finally ticked it off my unread shelf. And it was great. I really, really loved it. It's possibly in contention for one of my best books of the year. For those who don't know, this is part of a trilogy written by Marilyn Robinson about, all based in the fictional town of Gilead in Iowa. And this particular book focuses on Reverend John Ames, who has found out that he has an unspecified heart condition and is about to die. He's sort of in his 70s, and the book takes the form of a long letter written by Ames to his young son at the point where he knows he's going to die shortly. And Ames married fairly late in life after his first wife and child died. So he was in his 70s at the time of writing this book, whereas his son was probably around the age of 7 or 8. So through this letter, Ames shares his memories and his reflections on life, on faith, on his own family history. One of the interesting features of this book is that it's set in the 1950s. And because of that time frame, when Ames talks about his grandfather and his father and himself, those 3 generations span a period of American history where you go from the Civil War to the end of the 2 world wars. And so that's a really tumultuous time for the 3 generations of that family to have lived through. And the Civil War in particular had a real impact on that family because his grandfather was a fervent abolitionist, whereas his father was a pacifist. So that was a source of tension between those 2 generations of father and son. The book also explores Ames's relationship with his best friend's son, Jack, who returns to the town of Gilead after attempting to set up life elsewhere. And there's an underlying sense of insecurity and jealousy that John has of the younger man. And that jealousy comes into conflict with Ames's general sense of kind of gratitude and peace with the world. And it really disrupts him and takes him out of that kind of Zen place where he's trying to depart gracefully from this world, but at the same time he sees a younger man around his wife, around his son, and he's incredibly jealous of him. And those conflicting emotions culminates in this really beautiful and intense scene at the end of the book. And I won't spoil what it is, but it's really hard to sell this book, I think, because on the one hand, not much happens. It is just a very long letter written by a man at the end of his life, telling his son some things that he wants to pass on about his life and his family history. But on the other hand, there is a lot of internal drama that happens that only sort of gently bubbles to the surface. And there's a quiet elements about it. Not a lot happens, but a lot happens internally for all of the characters. And I just love the way that this book slowly unfolds and reveals itself to its readers. The descriptions about religion and religious thinking. I'm not a religious person at all, but I didn't find it off-putting. In fact, I found it fascinating. It was probably the more interesting aspect of this book, to read about how people of faith think about their faith and how they remain faithful and devoted despite everything else happening in the world and people drifting away more generally from being religious. And Robinson kind of weaves these meditations on faith and on the meaning of life through the story as you go. So you don't feel like you're kind of being hit with a giant block of it. It comes out very slowly in his kind of thinking about end of life and about this younger guy who comes into all of their lives. The book is incredibly introspective. It is graceful, both in the sense of elegance, but also in the sense that it is full of grace in a more religious way. And I really, really enjoyed it. I thought it was phenomenal. I actually can't wait to read the other two books in the trilogy. Now, we have a slight problem because, as you know, I'm not allowed to buy books at the moment until I finish my unread shelf. And I have Gilead, I have Lila, which I think is the third book in publication order, but I don't have Home. So if you know whether or not these books are meant to be read sequentially, let me know. But if not, I'm planning to just read Lila without reading the book in the middle. So we'll see how we go. But as far as Marilyn Robinson goes, this is my first time reading her, and I absolutely loved her writing style. It is so elegant. The prose is just beautiful, and the book kind of flows along like a kind of a gentle, wide river. That's the way I can describe it. It's just this really kind of it's neither fast-paced nor slow. It's just a very gentle flow of prose from beginning to the end, and it is absolutely wonderful to read. Highly recommend. Had a fantastic time with this book. The third book I read is Memories of Peking, Southside Stories by the Taiwanese writer Ling Haing. I will put a link to the English language translation as well as the title and author of this book in the description box, because I know some of it is harder to kind of track down, particularly when it's when I read it in the original. But there is an English language translation. I can't vouch for it. This is actually considered kind of a modern classic in China, as well as in Taiwan. So this is a series of semi-autobiographical short stories written by a Taiwanese writer. Ling Haing was born from a Taiwanese family in Osaka and spent her childhood in Beijing. So she has this weird mix of both being Taiwanese, but also having spent quite a few of her formative years in mainland China before her family kind of then fled during the Civil War back to Taiwan. And so the book is a series of loosely connected stories They can all be read independently, but they're told by the same narrator, who at the start of the story is kind of, I think, 7 years old, and at the end of it is 13. So because they track her maturity as a child, they are also sometimes considered together as kind of novel or autofiction. Each of the stories is based on the lives of everyday people who were in her family's lives when they were living on the south side of Beijing in the 1930s. And the stories are narrated, as I said, in the voice of a little girl and from the perspective of a child. And so there's a real sense of innocence and a lack of judgment of people when she meets them. She's not looking at the label of, well, this person is poor, this person is the help, this person is educated. She's looking at them in terms of how who they are as people, really, without any judgment, without any of the labels that come along with quite a hierarchical society as China was back in the 1930s, and to a certain extent still is. So the first story is when the narrator befriends a young woman in her neighborhood who's clearly suffering from some form of PTSD after her family gave away a child that she had out of wedlock. And so as a 7-year-old, the narrator was kind of the only person in that community who didn't judge this young woman by the social standards of that day, where she was shunned not only because she was a single mother and she had a child outside of wedlock, but also because she had quite significant mental illness that kind of made her not quite there occasionally during the course of the story. The stories themselves sort of develop in a way that is in parallel to the little girl growing up, so that you gradually notice the voice of the narrator maturing over the course of the book. And the book, the last story ends when she was 13 years old and her father dies, which sort of, to her, marks the end of her childhood and her period of innocence. I'm not spoiling anything because she literally says in the introduction here that, this is the story up until the death of my father, because I consider that to be the end of my childhood. This book was an instant hit when it was published in Taiwan and in mainland China, and it is really considered kind of a modern Chinese classic. It was adapted into a very popular film, and fun fact, the soundtrack to the film is like the ultimate graduation song in China. A lot of people kind of sing it as a graduation song, and it's very, very well known. And the book has a lot of cultural influence. It's very much connected with this sense of nostalgia for the old city of Beijing, much of which has been demolished. I absolutely loved it. I really thought the sense of innocence in the voice of the narrator was very natural. It didn't feel forced at all. The maturing of the narration from the first story when she was about 7 years old to the last story was very, very subtly done, and you sort of leave this book with a sense of melancholy and nostalgia at the end, but without feeling kind of it's not melodramatic in any way. It's this kind of it's like a gentle, warm hug. And the book so perfectly recreates Beijing in the 1930s and the lives of ordinary people back then. And you can tell from each of the stories, even though none of them talk about the political events that was going on in China during the day, where you've got the end of the Qing dynasty and the Republican period, but the Japanese are kind of right on the doorsteps, about to invade. And so all the lives of these ordinary people in the novel back then were being shaped by the extraordinary events of history that was happening in China. But she never really talks about the political and historic events of the time. She simply describes the people in a way that implies that a lot was going on in China at the time. I thought it was so beautifully done. There was a great sense of restraint, and there was a real love for not only her background as a Taiwanese or a Southern Chinese person living in the north of China in Beijing, but also a real sense of nostalgia that she has for Beijing, the Beijing of her childhood, the city that no longer exists. And I thought it was so charming. I had a fantastic time reading it. I can't, like I said, I can't really vouch for the English translation because I haven't read it. But if you are curious, I would recommend checking it out because it's a beautiful book. So that's the month of June. We have Memories of Peking, Southside Stories by Ling Haing. We have Gilead by Marilyn Robinson, fabulous book. And we have Tess of the D'Urbervilles, my Victorian read of the month by Thomas Hardy. And so of those 3 books, 2 were on my unread shelf. I keep a separate count of my foreign language books, so I neither add them to my unread list, nor do I take them off. So we started the month with 76 unread books. If you take off the 2 books of the 3 that I read, we're left with 74. It is a very slow progress into the 60s, everyone. I will be back very soon with another video. Until then, stay cool if you're in the Northern Hemisphere. Stay warm if you're like me, an Australian or New Zealander or South American, and you are in the middle of a very cold winter. And I will see you in about 2 weeks. Thanks, everyone.